I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. In this episode, I am joined by Justine Gluck, a policy analyst at the Future of Privacy Forum. She and I are going to unpack FPF's latest report, The State of State AI, Legislative Approaches to AI in 2025. This paper offers a deep dive into an important aspect of how AI law is being shaped, in particular here in the United States, where the future of AI is largely driven by state legislative activity, often focused on areas around targeted or transparency driven regulation. Justine and I will explore the key themes emerging from over 200 AI related bills introduced across 42 states, from context specific rules for healthcare and chatbots to liability frameworks and innovation sandboxes. Justine helps us understand just how these legislative trends reflect a shift away from a sweeping set of regulations to a more focused, nuanced, perhaps sector specific set of laws. If you're tracking the future of AI policy, this conversation offers an essential glimpse into where state level regulation is headed and what does that mean for developers, deployers, and consumers. Let's get started. Justine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So, I'm really looking forward to this conversation because there's been so much that's going on with AI. Many of our clients, many kind of folks who are in the community here are trying to keep up, frankly, about all of the various developments, not only what's happening in the EU, but importantly, what's happening in the United States. And so you were very helpful, you and FPF were very helpful to create a report that laid out all of the developments in 2025. And I really want to dive into, those trend lines that you're seeing. But maybe start high level in a short, succinct way. What would you describe the state of AI in 2025 in the United States?
Yeah, great question. A big question. I know, as you've mentioned, AI has been in the news, feels like constantly these days, and legislation being a big part of that. So, what we found in our report as a quick high level is that bills are being introduced and across, like, we tracked bills about 43 states this year, so a really wide spread of AI legislation. And that in general, we're seeing a trend of folks attempting to regulate AI in the US, both at the state level, that's where a lot of activity is, and then also in a more targeted way. So specifically looking at regulation that is addressing certain types of AI or certain use cases. So like, for example, in the healthcare industry, as opposed to like the bigger, more sweeping types of regulation, like perhaps like the EU AI Act, which is a little bit different.
So I'm going to summarize that as the way I would describe it as maybe uncoordinated. Whereas, contrast that against the EU approach where you have this one model, same kind of thing that they did in privacy with the GDPR. We do not have that in the United States and probably not likely to have it anytime soon. Thus, we have all of these very kind of very specific things that are happening as you're describing, going after these very specific sectors, very specific, aspects of AI, but none of those actually speak to each other and thus leave maybe something chaos. Maybe that's a different word that we could have used. What do you think?
I think honestly, I don't know if I would use the word chaos or the word uncoordinated. I think it's subjective, of course, but I think something that we found in our report is that there are really clear trends and through lines happening among states in the way that they're introducing legislation. So I'm sure we'll dive deeper into it as we get along, but we like divided our report and the bills that we tracked into three very specific themes. So bills that we're dealing with, again, like certain technologies, bills that were dealing with certain use cases, and then bills that were specifically dealing with liability and accountability issues. And in those three themes, we did see a lot of overlap among states, whether that be, exact bills that were being replicated from state to state, or very similar types of legislation that is focused on, again, those like very specific cases. So you're absolutely right that we don't have a federal framework in the US, and we'll see if that emerges in the next couple of years or not. But there are still some like very common themes that are happening amongst the states when it comes to AI legislation.
All right, let's dive into those because one of the things that I think your report outlines, and I think what we have seen is that one of the trend lines that you're mentioning is to stay away from the broad, sweeping version of the legislation that have the EU AI model or what the Colorado AI law,
Sure.
had created that was at some point thought to be like, hey, we need to create the future of what this AI legislation is going to look like. I don't
Mhm.
think we've seen that in 2025 be replicated. Instead, it's much more narrow, very specific aspects of AI.
Mhm.
And so, one, interested in your thoughts on that trend line, and two, whether you think that that is, where we can expect the future of AI legislation in the United States.
Yeah, I think that sums it up really well. In 2024, we had the Colorado AI Act, which you mentioned, which is a great example of a bill that, attempted to regulate multiple types of AI and multiple use cases in like a much broader way. In 2025, we did not see any bills that were signed into law in that same approach. And in general, there were, a couple minor updates. Like there was an attempt to narrow down the Colorado AI Act, and ultimately that bill was just postponed for additional year. But other than those types of attempts in existing law, we didn't see any new, like again, comprehensive AI frameworks passed in 2025. So to the second part of your question, I do think that's a trend that's going to continue into 2026, is this focus on more narrow and targeted types of regulation that again are addressing very specific technologies or very specific use cases. I think if I had to guess kind of where that's coming from, I think folks, as we've gotten deeper and deeper into the AI space and we see how AI is integrated into all of our industries from law to healthcare to finance, I think we're realizing it's a really complicated technology that, deserved very specified attention, perhaps. I think it's kind of what lawmakers are coming to see, that it's easier, both in terms of actually getting bills passed and through the legislative process and having agreement on legislation for those bills to be more targeted, and also perhaps, addressing a technology that is complex and unwieldy in many ways. It's easier to do that in more targeted legislation.
So what are those targets, right? We mentioned that you were referring to different types of transparency obligations, different type of
Mhm.
liability regimes. Where do you see the trend lines for those specific narrow focus areas?
Yeah, so for FPF in 2025, we tracked 210 bills in 42 states. So, quite a few. And we ultimately grouped those bills that we tracked to three specific categories. And the first category was use and context specific bills. So that's legislation that deals, health was a really big theme this year. I think we saw a lot of bills that were ultimately signed into law dealing with health, whether that be mental health through chatbots or liability questions about whether or not a licensed professional, a doctor or a counselor, can be using AI or not in their practice. So that was a really big trend. But also in that kind of broader category are like bills about employment or even like finance. And then we also have technology specific bills. So I brought up chatbots. I think that is a huge theme in 2025 that we're going to also see carry through into 2026. Our bills really specifically targeting certain types of AI technologies, both chatbots, and then another one is frontier and foundation models, which we've seen legislation in both California and New York on that this year. And then generative AI as well. And that's something we've seen, in years past as well. And then finally, this like liability an accountability type theme. That's like a more nuanced topic. It involves a lot of different bills, but I think something we've seen is legislators attempting to balance innovation alongside regulation. So things like regulatory sandboxes, which I'm happy to speak more about, that's a theme that we've seen starting to emerge in that category, and we see legislation on that topic, as well as bills that are very specifically including things like different like liability regimes that will allow folks to like affirmative defenses are one theme as well.
So, if I'm thinking about those things, right, I think the part that I pause on is to say that, while those are, different aspects of the things that legislatures are trying to legislate in the United States, and so there is commonality, call it, between
Mhm.
looking at specific types of technology, calling, hey, I need to have this particular type of transparency notice, this particular type of disclosure, or I need to focus on this particular type of data, this
Mhm.
particular type of vulnerable audience, whether that be children or patients or any of the other kind of ways that we have historically approached things. those are all commonalities. But
Hmm.
and I'm interested in your views on this, is that
Hmm.
the actual substantive requirements across all of those trend lines are not the same. It's not that you now have, 15 states have passed the same transparency law and were provided the same type of notice such that entities who are managing compliance to those have one piece of paper they need to create and satisfies
Hmm.
15 different laws. We have this other set of different laws. So is that consistent with your research? And then, two, where do you see the types of substantive obligations under those broad categories?
Sure. Yeah. I think that that makes a lot of sense. Yes, so though we've seen bills that have been introduced across states in very similar themes, of course, the bills are not identical, and the requirements do differ from state to state. Even within states, sometimes there's bills being introduced on the same topic, and the requirements differ from bill to bill. And California is a great example of that sometimes. I think maybe this is useful to just provide an example here. So something that was really a big bill this year was SB 53 in California, which was a frontier and foundation model bill. And New York actually introduced a very similar bill. Both bills were based on an earlier bill in California that was vetoed by Newsom. So these are a great example of two bills that are on very, very similar topics, aiming to regulate frontier and foundation models and to set transparency requirements so that developers of the most advanced models are, talking about their internal controls and how they ensure safety and security and things of that nature. But we at FPF did like an analysis on how do those requirements really differ? What does that mean for compliance for folks that might operate in both states if both laws were to be signed? And you see that there are, key differences in how the bills are requiring different measures for companies. So, for example, in California, the bill SB 53 requires frontier developers to do transparency reports. So, every year there's a different transparency report where they're talking about internal controls, things like that, whereas that's not a requirement in New York. But the New York bill, for example, has a prohibition on using frontier and foundation models, deploying them at all under certain circumstances, which isn't the case in the California bill. So I think that's a good example of kind of what you're talking about, where we're seeing similar bills being introduced, but companies will have to take care of how they're complying across state lines where there are differences between the two versions of bills. And I think that we do still see a lot of overlap. I think when you think about how to comply with those kind of laws, there are a lot of commonalities, but yes, you do still have to beware, watch out the differences between the bills. And I think that's something that states are starting to grapple with as they're introducing legislation that maybe starts out similar, but of course, along the way in the process gets, changed by their respective state houses.
And that I think is right. And I would maybe add that this is essentially we've seen this movie before because I think one of the areas of things that I see is that, people who are new to the privacy and data space seem to think that, all of the state legislation that we have seen through the past 5, 6 years coming from the CCPA and all of the various other states that have adopted the same ones is like, well, that is the privacy laws that exist in the United States, which is absurd because we have decades of privacy laws that look very similar to all of these AI laws. When I first started doing this, I mean, this was back in like the early 2000s, right? So 20 something years ago. We were in a position where we were looking and doing 50 state surveys of just laws that applied to different types of sensitive data. And those 50 state surveys of just that particular narrow topic was 1,000 pages long. And, that would be how can you be able to disclose whether somebody has HIV or whether you can disclose that somebody has tuberculosis or somebody that, has a sexually transmitted disease, somebody who is pregnant. You can imagine there's all of these various different types of debates that were happening at the time where these types of privacy laws came into effect and lots of news attention around the HIV issues and the prejudices that were being, imposed upon people with HIV and, a lot of the uncertainty around it. So all of the states essentially adopted their own version of an HIV law. And the trend was certainly to have an HIV law. There was a commonality in that everyone had one. The compliance with that, chaotic, because all of them had very different aspects. You could disclose it to a parent, but you couldn't disclose it to a law enforcement. You could disclose it to your sibling, but not your neighbor. You could disclose it to a neighbor so long as that they were a personal representative, but you could not disclose it to a child, right? Like it's a all sorts of various permutations about how those laws have been set. And they're still
Sure.
on the books. They haven't gone away. And frankly,
Sure.
the folks who are like looking at this particular area and saying, well, I'm just going to look at the CCPA or I'm just going to look at kind of all of the Washington My Health My Data, we're kind of missing the whole body of law that already is there and is still has never been extinguished.
Yeah.
What you're describing around, all of these very specific aspects of AI laws strikes me as that we're still essentially in the early days of privacy here before it took 30 something years to establish something that was more robust in its coverage in the way that the CCPA did or the GDPR or any of the other
Hmm.
state laws
Sure.
that have the similar kind of themes. What
Hmm.
do you think?
I agree with that. I think we're definitely still in the stage with AI legislation. It's so new. The technology is so new. The attempts to regulate are so new that we are definitely still seeing legislators in that brainstorming phase where folks are trying to grapple with what is the best model? Is there a blueprint that we want to follow? Is there a certain application of AI that we want to forefront in our legislation? I think that that is um, definitely still under discussion and still under debate amongst the states. I think I'm curious to see what topics we might end up kind of coming to that's quote unquote blueprint to. I think again something like chatbots is something we might see in 2026, or we have perhaps federal legislation or a federal standard that helps to create some sort of commonality of the way that chatbots are being regulated in the US. I think that's a possibility, but there are definitely a lot of areas of AI that are still very new and that we are having the same experience that you've discussed in the privacy landscape.
So, I mean, the other thing that I like to kind of think about here is just the way that the US legal system works, which is it's different and maybe than many folks who are outside the United States who may be listening. And it really is, in some ways, I think, playing out with AI here because the folks who have kind of had this conversation with the past will remember that kind of my view of this is like this that the way that we have historically been able to create legislation is typically to address some sort of harm, right? Where there is some sort of problem and we're trying to prohibit something that was going to result in that particular problem.
Hmm.
And it is not so much a forward-thinking approach around how we would want to manage this stuff at the start.
Hmm.
We
Yeah.
don't have speed limits in the United States because some folks stepped back and said, "Hey, we have these new cars and they're going to go really fast, and let's come up with a speed set of regulations to be able to manage this." Like we don't have that. The reason why we have speed limits was fuel consumption and concerns around how is it that we were being able to conserve fuel in the late 70s, then traffic safety and personal safety and all of those were essentially trying to prevent some specific harm that
Hmm.
thus regulation of speed was the way that we were trying to address that harm.
Hmm. Yeah.
Chatbots is a classic example of this because there's been a lot of focus in the media, a lot of focus in the policy aspects of like, well, how are these chatbots operating? Is there a way that this is going to result in all sorts of concern for people who are using them, not know how they work, not know that there's
Yeah.
a human on the other side of them, that they are going to be, used as for
Yeah.
predatory practices, that they're going to hallucinate and create all sorts of content that are not appropriate for the audience. Like all of these
Hmm.
various things, these are all harms that we're now worried about.
Hmm.
And my guess is that the legislation here is going to say, well, these are all of the harms. Let's figure out a way of addressing those particular harms. And the difficulty is not everybody can agree on the harms, and not everybody
Hmm.
can agree as whether those harms should be actually addressed. And if they do, how to
Hmm.
address them,
Yeah.
which then results in the commonality, that theme, chatbot legislation, for sure. The chaos is how to
Mm,
do all of that. Because if I'm having a chatbot functionality in my product offering,
sure.
I have one. I don't have a California one. I don't have a Utah one. I don't have a
Hmm.
Colorado one.
Yes.
I have one. And thus, I need to make sure I'm in a position to be able to adapt to all of these different
Mm-hmm.
technologies in one solution. That is hard. And
Hmm.
thus, the lack of synergy between these laws makes the innovation in this space even more difficult. Interested in your view on that.
Yeah, I think the chatbots is such an interesting example. Something that we explore a little bit in our report is how the word chatbot is being defined in law, because I think you have a great point. There are very different types of chatbots. We've seen like a lot of litigation, a lot of stories coming out about really devastating cases of youth in particular facing instances of self-harm or suicidal ideation after talking with usually companion chatbots, so like a very specific type of chatbot that isn't like a customer service, chatbot that you have integrated into your product. It's more of a chatbot specifically designed to like simulate an emotional, like sustained relationship with its user. But then the question does become, how do you scope legislation if you're trying to deal with that specific problem? If you're trying to specifically deal with youth who may develop like emotional relationships with chatbots that are encouraging them to engage in self-harm practices. How do you scope legislation to deal with just that very specific use case and not, accidentally or, incidentally scope in different types of chatbots that are being used just for returning my products or, customer service questions that just isn't creating the same kind of relationship with its user. So it's just something that we do explore in our report is how are states beginning to define the word chatbot? How are they defining companion chatbots if that's the type of legislation that they're trying to scope, and what may or may not, accidentally or incidentally fall under that definition, and how are the laws being addressed. I think that you're correct. And again, this idea that we're creating legislation on similar themes, but it may differ from state to state in its actual, both its scope and in its requirements. There are themes that we see when it comes to chatbots. I think of the 7 chatbot bills we tracked this year, 6 of them really focused on like just disclosures. So notifying users that chatbot is not human during their conversation. But again, very much different in like the way that those notifications are being prescribed. So certain state laws are saying you need to put that notification on every 3 hours. Some states are only if the user asks. And as you mentioned, of course, if you're a large company running a chatbot, it's difficult to do that on a state by state basis.
So, Justine, I think that you mentioned two of the four themes that you identified as part of the review that you undertook. In particular, I think you mentioned that there were, one theme was around this use and context specific rules, in particular around the uses of AI in healthcare and employment, and then, ones that are more technology specific, right? Those are the chatbots
Mhm.
just referencing. There are two other themes that I think you identified. What were those, and where did you see the legislation start to adapt to address those concerns?
Yeah, one of them is government uses of AI. We mentioned that theme in this report, but we don't dive into depth in it. Just wasn't the focus of some of the bills that we tracked. But we do like to look at what governments are regulating their internal use of AI. I think oftentimes when you look at how governments are approaching AI and how it's being used in certain government agencies or procurement standards for AI in the government, then you kind of get a sense of what may be coming for legislation that's scoped more for the private sector. So we do identify that kind of grouping of bills, but don't necessarily dive deep into it in our report. But our other category is new liability regimes for accountability. So these are bills that specifically are aiming to encourage like responsible AI practices, create legal protections, and like regulatory clarity, which of course is that includes many bills that may fall into other categories, but the bills that we really put in this category are, again, bills that prioritize innovation focused measures. So, a lot of those bills deal with regulatory sandboxes, which is something we've seen pop up in Utah and Delaware and Texas. Which are bills that create kind of a safe harbor, in a sense, provision for companies to experiment with new technologies outside of some of the existing legal parameters in the state. Utah is experimenting with one right now, dealing with mental health chatbots. So that's kind of an interesting place to look at. And we also have bills in that category that specifically are including provisions like affirmative defenses to incentivize responsible practices. So things like that, and other like enforcement tools and like defense strategies.
So does that, I mean, what does those types of defensive tools or defense strategies or sandboxes look like? Is this something that you're saying that with the safe harbor, so long as I comply with, XYZ parameters, then I'm not going to be able to be sued by the users of those pieces of technology? And then if so, what do those parameters look like?
Yeah, so AI sandboxes are honestly very, very new in the US. You've seen them pop up in other countries, but again, there's three states kind of experimenting with those right now. I know the White House's AI action plan calls out regulatory sandboxes as an opportunity that might be of interest to states and the federal government in the future. So we might see more of them coming. But Utah's kind of the first state to start actually putting it into practice. And right now, I believe they have this one company that they're working with that's developing a mental health chatbot, but a recent law was passed in Utah that regulates mental health chatbots that was signed earlier this year. So, from what I understand of regulatory sandboxes, it kind of allows companies to have space to, yeah, create innovative products that the government is then, watching the way they're developing it, getting information from how they're developing it, but they have the space and capacity to innovate in a way that perhaps existing law doesn't quite allow them to do otherwise, but has that accountability side of things because again, the state is involved in a sense of that process.
And Justine, I mean, that's kind of a great, you know, example of the underlying tension and that we're seeing, all right? Because I think what makes legislation in this space so hard is that everybody is anticipating that, AI is going to be a revolutionary technology. And, I think folks in some ways, people are seeing that in some very specific applications, and the promise of it, could be so much more. We'll see. But the difficulty is trying to then say, well, is this something that we should just let go unencumbered? Think early days of the internet, where the concern was that, and I think, as people look backward and say that the United States approach has been essentially a deregulatory environment, let people be able to use the internet and develop the internet in ways that without necessarily regulation. That you can contrast that against the EU model. You can contrast that against, what's happened in China, which was very different approaches, those two
Mhm,
in particular, not having the same approach, but just different approaches. Um, and so then are we, and in some ways, that saw really great innovation without not having the regulatory arm and oversight for it. And we created all of these technology companies as a result. And there shouldn't be any coincidence that we saw all of that technology growth here in the United States. So that, but of course, the internet is not without its own harms. It's not without its own dangers, right? And so we kind of, figured out, well, how are we going to try to manage those particular issues? If I fast forward and think about that same AI, the same issues with respect to AI, we're in a position of still trying to find the balance between innovation and regulation. And in some cases, if you're seeing, these pieces of legislation come out, the legislators here are almost signaling we're not going to let the internet develop in the way that it was, or importantly, not going to let AI develop in the way that internet was developing. We're going to do something
sure.
more. And whether that's just a lot more transparency, whether it's a lot more of kind of, different types of notices and disclosures, maybe that's it.
Hmm.
But I'm interested as you're exploring these different types of bills, both the ones that have been passed and frankly the ones that have not. How are you
Hmm.
seeing that debate play out between innovation and regulation, between the ability of creating value and jobs and technology that will be really helpful for humans in general, but at the same time have a acute and very specific detrimental impact on few individuals who may be either using that technology or whose data is maybe using it may be ingested in that technology or any of
Mhm.
the other ways where these harms may occur.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you just identified the biggest debate that's happening in the AI regulatory space right now, which is, again, how do we balance innovation with consumer protection? I think that is something that everyone's grappling with on the state and the federal level for sure. I think I think if you look to some, again, the themes that we're seeing this year in legislation, you see the way that lawmakers are starting to try to strike that balance. Again, we're seeing less comprehensive legislation. We're also seeing a really big focus on bills that have to do with transparency and disclosures. So perhaps not mandating or prohibiting certain systems from existing or creating things like audits that are perhaps more intensive in terms of resources or time, but instead doing things like just consumer disclosures or transparency measures that take less resources. I think that's been a trend that we've seen in 2025, and that might speak to the way that lawmakers are trying to balance innovation with, again, consumer protection. I think also we see, as you mentioned, a lot of bills dealing with topics like health, I think is a good example. So perhaps lawmakers thinking, what are the most critical areas or what are the areas where consumer protection is the most paramount and innovation maybe in some ways come secondary or is still in tandem, but I think we see a lot of legislation in health perhaps for that reason. We're focusing on that as like a key area of consumer protection, especially mental health and especially topics of minors and youth. So I think that's kind of where that balance is being struck a bit more, is again in the sort of topics that are being focused on and in the type of disclosures and the type of requirements that we're seeing in bills. I think we said in the report there are softer requirements. So again, like more consumer facing disclosures as opposed to those types of requirements that we've seen maybe in the Colorado AI Act or other bills that are a bit more intense or involve more requirements on the part of the companies or the developers or deployers of the models.
Yeah, and again, that just seems like this is the repeat of the same movie, right? In terms of like, oh, let's go after health, let's go after mental health, let's go after
Yeah.
trying to protect children, let's going to go in a way that we're going to address very specific vulnerable populations, where frankly, maybe there is more bipartisan, points of view
Yeah.
on these things, and the balance of trying to strike between innovation and regulation or consumer protection and innovation will become, finding much more common ground. Maybe that's my interest in maybe the next question here is one of the things that you include in your report is a breakdown of perhaps a view or a high level view of how partisan politics plays into
Mhm.
AI legislation. Um,
Mhm.
what did you find when you were looking at, how many of these bills were being supported or being introduced by folks on who would label themselves as a Democrat versus those who are Republican?
Yeah, that was an interesting finding for us for sure. I think we said in the report that Democratic legislators introduced more than about 75% of AI related bills, but that 41% of the bills that were signed into law were actually introduced by Republicans. And I'll note that that number was actually close to 75% signed by Republicans before California's session closed. Obviously, California is a full-time legislature that is very democratically led and produces a lot of bills. But still 41% signed by Republican introduced legislators is like a really sizable amount. So I think we say in the report that we do see that there's influence on both sides of the aisle when it comes to the AI conversation. We do see differences in the type of bills that are being introduced. I think in general, the Republican introduced bills focus a lot on government use cases, on liability protections, whereas the Democrat introduced bills tend to prioritize like transparency and consumer protections a bit more. So while there is this like bipartisan interest, there are some differences among political parties of the types of measures that were introduced and enacted or enrolled. But there definitely is interest on both sides of the aisle, which we've definitely seen this year, both on the state and the federal level.
Yeah, I think that's true too. I think these issues are important to wherever it is you stand on the political spectrum. And so question of how or what to do, those probably may differ. But whether the issues or the problems that people can anticipate, I think I think many people have that as a concern, which maybe is my last question, Justine. Having taken, a deep dive into what's happened in 2025, what's happened in 2024. The key question then is, well, what does 2026 look like? And you have a number of pieces
Mhm.
of legislation that have been proposed in 2025
Yeah,
that have not been adopted. Those pieces of legislation just don't immediately expire and, be deleted off people's hard drives in 2026. My guess it will
sure.
form the basis of the debate that we will see over the course of the next year. So maybe putting on your prognosticator hat, what would you think of the future of, at least over the course of the next year, of
Yeah.
AI legislation at the state level?
Yeah. I think that we're going to see a real continuation of 2025, honestly. I think we're going to see a lot of the same topics being put in the forefront. I've been calling 2026 the year of chatbots. I think we're going to see a huge influx of chatbot legislation across states. I think with the passage of the Frontier and Foundation Model bill in California, as well as one in New York, we've seen one introduced in Michigan. We're going to see some states perhaps experiment with that topic as well more and more. I think those are two topics that we're going to see more of. In our report, we talk about three different areas to watch in 2026 that maybe are a bit newer. So the first is agentic AI or AI agents, which are capable of autonomous action, a little bit different than something like a chatbot. And we actually haven't seen really legislation scope specifically to those types of technologies in 2025. And we, theorize that we may see legislation on AI agents in 2026. That's something maybe to look out for. We've also seen towards the end of 2025 more an introduction of more bills on algorithmic pricing. So these are proposals targeting practices where like large data sets and algorithms determine and adjust the prices or products offered to consumers, which isn't necessarily a new idea, but we've seen how AI might amplify like the scale and precision of doing that. So I'm expecting to see a lot of bills in 2026, perhaps on this topic of algorithmic pricing and seeing if those are introduced across different states. We also talk about something that we've called definitional uncertainty. So, this idea that states are still varying in how they're defining certain terms in legislation. So, defining artificial intelligence itself, but also the way they're defining different types of AI. So, defining frontier foundation models, generative AI, chatbots. We're still seeing a lot of variation among those definitions. So, we discuss in the report the ways that we see those definitions either coming closer together or perhaps coming further apart, and what to look for in 2026 when it comes to defining AI itself, which, of course, the definition of a certain technology and legislation can drastically change the scope of a bill. So, those are some things we see. And I think just again, a continuation of some of the key topics that we saw in 2025. So, health, chatbots, and a more targeted approach to AI. I think we're going to see that in 2026. I don't anticipate a return of the more sweeping frameworks that perhaps we saw in 2024.
Justine, really appreciate your insights. The report that you created with FPF is fantastic in terms of giving an overview of where we are and I appreciate your perspective on where we're going.
Thanks so much. Happy to share.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.